It's basically, it sounds hyperbolic for me to say, but truthfully, this is basically an attempt to bring back the 3/5 compromise and reinstitute an antebellum-esque social order. But instead of black people as the underclass, it's women as the underclass. Not even kidding. What was I going to talk about? Oh, yeah. That's one of the, like, that... The Boys has a sister show about college? What? Really? That's fucking crazy. I didn't know that. That was... Okay. I know I talked a big game about the, like, conservatives trying to retool college to be an ideological indoctrination machine to protect their interests, their class interests, their ideological interests. Something V? Oh, okay. Yeah, like Compound V. Yeah, I don't know. Campus V? I don't know. University V? College V? Probably something of that sort. I talked a big game about the demands that were made of Columbia University, because that is some fascist shit, you know? Very much like one-to-one with what happened in Nazi Germany, where any of the intelligentsia that didn't openly, like, straightforwardly comply with the Nazis were subject to massive amounts of pressure or like arrest or anything like that. Yeah, it's a reminder that, like, oh, we fucking live in a fascist shithole. But you know what's even more of a reminder? That was just the warm-up. That was just the opening act. The real meat of the matter that I think I want to focus on is that Congress finally got off of its ass to do something, and in true fashion of whenever Congress does something, it usually hurts you. Shoutouts to Maxor. They passed a little thing called the SAVE Act. And of course, shoutouts to George Orwell. Fucking Ministry of Love looks inside endless torture devices. Great, thank you. The SAVE Act is basically a method of stripping away the 19th Amendment without stripping away the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment being what legally grants women the right to vote in this country. The contents of the SAVE Act are that there are new voter ID requirements that are going to be instituted federally. It hasn't passed the Senate yet. It hasn't been made into law yet, but it did pass the House. And those requirements are basically that you have a passport or birth certificate with your full legal name on it, right? Which to some people, I'm sure, sounds innocuous until you realize that fucking, like, a good percent, like 30% or something of Americans don't have a passport. And most women in America, there are a lot of women in this country, most women who are eligible to vote otherwise do not have a birth certificate with their legal name on it. Why? Because when women get married, it's tradition, it's not legally required, but it is tradition that they change their last name to the name of their husband, right? Normally, this doesn't pose a problem because voter ID is dumb as fuck, and it is a solution in search of a problem, and they can just, you know, provide their driver's license or social security number and be like, yeah, I got married. And they'll be like, okay, you know? But if this law were to pass, any woman who is married and has had a last name change would be not eligible to vote. They would have to re-register. And in fact, if their legal name does not match the name on their birth certificate, they may never be eligible to vote again, unless they change their legal name back to their legal name that they had at birth. And of course, this also affects trans people. If you have had a legal name change for any reason from that which appears on your birth certificate, under this law, you would no longer be able to vote. Women who got married, trans people who transitioned, or even if you just fucking didn't like your name. Maybe you, like, I don't know, you cut contact with your parents and he's like, I want a name change, you know, forget that shit. Or you just felt like it. You would no longer be eligible to vote as a result of this bill. And of course, the reason that the Republicans are passing this bill, because it's a fucking Republican bill, although Democrats voted for it, there are a handful of Democrats in the House that voted for this. The reason that they're passing this is because, number one, the far right hates women. Obviously, we all know this. You know, they think that they should be chattel property and answer to their husbands. I mean, we all remember that Sam Cedar debate. They fucking said that straight up. But the big kicker is that this would prevent Democrats from ever winning elections again. Yes, because it targets women and trans people as well, but like, you know, women being the largest demographic, women vote mostly left-leaning in America, which means they'll vote for Democrats if they're on the ballot, or in municipal elections. Sometimes that also means stuff like the Working Families Party. Some of the good shit that's happening at the local level, that like the support base for the working class and for progressive movements is built off of you know, well, a broad coalition, but a lot of women are part of that coalition. So Republicans are figuring, if we can disenfranchise all the women, then no biggie. We get to stay in power and see our ideological priorities through. So let's just pass this act that makes it, like, illegal to vote if you've had a name change ever at any point in your life. You know? Love my fucking liberal democracy, or whatever the fuck is left of it, where you can just do that. Like I said, this is kind of a way of repealing the 19th Amendment without repealing the 19th Amendment. It's basically, it sounds hyperbolic for me to say, but truthfully, this is basically an attempt to bring back the 3/5 compromise and reinstitute an antebellum-esque social order. But instead of black people as the underclass, it's women as the underclass. Not even kidding, you know? I wish everyone had to solve an algebra problem to vote. That would probably, well, yeah. I don't know how that would go, but, you know. Generally, I'm against that kind of poll testing and whatever. Look, we know, you know, government of the people, by the people, for the people, but the people are retarded. We know this, but democracy is still the least shit system out of every system that we've ever come up with. Unintentionally in the game I'm playing, they're like, oh shoot, we have an evil capitalism. I know how to stop it. Fascism. That's true. Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this in another stream. Fascism has to pretend to be, like, anti-capitalist in some respects to gain support. They have to pretend to be anti-establishment. You know? Literally, we need Palpatine. That's funny as fuck. Let me look up the Save Act. According to a Brennan Center expert. Yeah, here we go. Let's see. Where is the documents requirement? Yeah, look, Morales Doyle, this is a lawyer at the Brennan Center, I believe, said this new documents requirement could create a barrier for a significant number of Americans. Our research shows that about 21.3 million American citizens don't have these documents readily available. And by these documents, I mean a birth certificate or a passport. That's a good, like, I guess I overestimated when I said, like, 30%. That's a good, like, 9, almost 10% of Americans. Actually, no, that's more than 10% of the voting public don't have that documentation. Where, like, you know, if somebody asked, hey, do you have your papers? Not only would they say, like, not only would they not have them, they just wouldn't. It's not only, like, would they not have them, on their person, they just wouldn't have them at all. These, let's see, he added that the estimate doesn't include the millions more whose documents don't match their current names. For example, women who've been married and have changed their name recently. Yeah, you have to get, like, your passport and stuff and other forms of ID updated to reflect a name change, you know? for certain administrative purposes. But here's the kicker. You can't do that with a birth certificate. Your birth certificate is information that is reflective of what you were given at the time of your birth. That to me, I think, is the big kicker, where they would institute this new document requirement, including a birth certificate. That, more than anything else, is the grounds to just, like, blanket disenfranchise tens of millions of women in this country from voting, because you can't change a birth certificate. That's what fucking makes it a birth certificate. What even is the point of the birth certificate? It's to have an official record of your birth. And when you get a birth certificate, it's used for such purposes as, like, getting you a social security number, which is important. It's one of the few fucking social safety nets that exist in this country. How do orphans get birth certificates? Good question. Some of them don't have them. You can get a birth certificate later in life. My grandfather had to do this. In Morocco, this my grandfather on my mother's side, it was Moroccan, and he was actually born in a setting where certain documentation was not actually kept track of. He had to get a birth certificate later in life to fit the more administrative state that Morocco was becoming. And on his birth certificate, it actually says January 1st, I think, 1937, because the way they didn't keep track of, like, your exact birthday. Like, it was a fucking tribal setting. So what they did was, for every person whose last name began A through F, or not A through F, A through, like, the first 13 letters of the alphabet, if you had a last name that started with one of those letters, they assign you the birth date of January 1st, whatever year you were born. And then for people who had a last name beginning with one of the latter 13 letters, the second half of the alphabet, they gave you July 1st and the year you were born. So my granddad's birth certificate reads January 1st, 1937, specifically because when he was born, they didn't have birth certificates. They didn't do that. And of course, in most countries, there is an administrative mechanism where you can say, like, yeah, I don't have a birth certificate. And there is a way to get that sorted. You know? Find it funny how you need documentation for a point in time where you didn't have consciousness? It can pose problems for sure. That, like, the fact that such thorough documentation has to exist for every given person. But part of the reason that that documentation exists as well is so that administrative systems can find you for the purpose of rendering aid, for incorporating you into the social safety net, right? If you can believe it, Morocco has more robust social safety protections. A more robust social democracy exists in Morocco, which has been pretty nakedly authoritarian, than in the United States, right? Healthcare. Healthcare can be accessed for free at any public hospital in Morocco. And at a private insurer or a private hospital that takes private insurance, you'd probably only pay something like $3. And I mean 3, not 30, not 300, 3. You know? I believe they've also been expanding their public education system as well. Don't quote me on that, no. I'm not an expert. If you're a person that showed up out of nowhere one day, you'd have to do so much just to exist. Oh, yeah. And I actually think that is fucked up. In fact, I take that to be sort of a point of argument that, like, supports the argument that we're in a very, like, stagnant and declining system because of how much red tape you have to cut through just to be, like, legally permitted to exist in certain settings, you know? But regardless, I maintain that the birth certificate component of the SAVE Act is probably the most damning one. and that is specifically indicative that this is designed to strip women of their voting rights. You know? Next section reads, this is not a typical voter ID law. Yeah, no shit. Morales-Doyle says there's a distinction between this proposal and existing voter ID laws. This is not a voter ID law, he said. This is not a show your driver's license when you go to vote. Something you already have to do in most states, I think. This is a show your papers law. He explained that the bill would require voters to show original proof of citizenship, like a birth certificate or passport, just to register every time you register or re-register. Saying this might be bad should be illegal at this point. Yeah, like, fucking, the fact that every institution you could point to is complicit in the decline that led us to this because they either didn't do anything or both sides the issue. It would make registration more complicated. Damn, no shit. If the bill becomes law, Morales-Doyle said many voters will need to start preparing now, especially if they need to order needed documents. Yeah, like if you don't, like a lot of Americans don't have a passport. It's a big country. Most people never need to leave. Therefore, there's never the need for a passport for a lot of people. You know? Let me continue. Once I get to a straightaway, that is. Oh, yeah, a golden? That's rough. That can be a lot of work. It can mean spending a lot of money on a passport. Yeah, it's fucking expensive to get some of this shit done. You know, getting the required ID to like vote or do all this other shit is not free. That's what makes voter suppression laws, like voter ID laws, so effective, is that you create a financial barrier or an economic barrier to people being able to exercise their right to vote. Kind of like the right to an attorney, right? The right to an attorney, I don't think anybody would really acknowledge that the right to a lawyer is a real right that you have in this country. It's written in the Constitution, but functionally you don't actually have the right to a lawyer because, as I've explored in other live streams, you only have the right to the best lawyer that money can buy. If you don't have money, then theoretically, yeah, you know, you can rely on public defenders, but like you're kind of shit out of luck. Could mean going and finding your birth certificate and proof that you are the person on that birth certificate because you've changed your name. Yeah, that's the big problem. He added that can take time, so you're going to need to do it well in advance of the elections. Here we go. Voters in rural areas would face higher barriers. The SAVE Act would end common registration methods like online mail-in or voter registration drives. That's like the only way to register. Seriously. The only method that exists other than that is to go to the nearest voter registrar. Anybody fucking know what the voter registrar is or where it is? You have to go to a courthouse for that shit. You know? Morales-Doyle warned that this would especially affect people who live in remote areas. There are definitely people who live 10, 20, 50, 100 miles away from the closest election official, people who live in rural places or tribal lands. They're going to have a big burden placed on their ability to get registered. And that's by design, of course. I added the that's by design. NPR would never fucking include that. Supporters of the bills, like House Speaker Mike Johnson, say it would increase public trust in elections. Fuck off, dude. Again, with the fucking, like, both sides. Oh, well, you know, the Republicans say this will bolster the confidence that Americans have in the integrity of our elections. No, you fucking moron. Elections have already been decided by people who should have otherwise been eligible to vote, but couldn't because of inane voter suppression shit like this. They're just introducing this so that they never lose another election again. And they know it. And they're relying on the liberal media laundering their image in order to achieve that. You know, to put people to sleep enough to just, like, walk all over whatever's left of, like, free and fair elections in this country. Never seen a courthouse in my life. I have been inside a courthouse, but, like, take it from me, it is an extremely obscure part of public life to require that you go to a courthouse to do something as fucking simple as registering to vote. Like, dog. You know where I registered to vote? I registered to vote at, I think the registrar. And then, like, I applied for a ballot at the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles. This would take that away. The DMV is one of the places that does voter registration drives. I voted in high school that I didn't even go to. Yeah. Well, that's different. That's a polling place, right? Although this would eliminate same-day registration, which means that you can't go to the school or the library that's having the election and register on site. In this country, you can do it online, lol. You can in America, too. That's the crazy thing. You can register to vote online. This bill is trying to take that away. You know? And yes, obviously, most countries like in Europe and even, you know, South America do this way better than America does. They make it really easy for people to vote, you know, generally speaking. It is just America and I think Russia that does this. Classic voter suppression. Yeah. You might not have caught the first bit of this, but this bill would it would reverse. Let's see here. Where is it? It would get rid of online registration, vote by mail registration. So like registration by mail. It would get rid of voter registration drive registration, so you can't go to the DMV anymore. And it would require you to show original proof of citizenship, which means you would have to show your passport or your birth certificate in order to vote. And if you had a name change that isn't reflected on one of those documents, you would be barred from voting. Like I said, this is specifically targeted at women who are married, you know, or who have had a name change. And for many of those women, they would have to either, like, they would have to change their name back to what it was on their birth certificate in order to be able to vote. You can't change a birth certificate. That's kind of what makes it a birth certificate. You know, it's supposed to be roughly, you know, reflective of your circumstances at birth. Yeah, there is no longer, if this passes, it has passed the House of Representatives, it still needs to pass the Senate in order to reach the president, and he would still need to sign it into law. But I have no doubt that those two things are going to happen because it has complete Republican support, and the Democrats have already folded on this. The Democrats in the House, there's already a contingent of them who have voted to pass the bill. And, you know, Chuck Schumer is still the leader in the Senate, so there's nothing that they're going to really be willing to do there. You know, they're just going to roll over like they always do. You know? And yeah, you know, if this passes, which again, I have no reason to believe it won't, there is no peaceful escape from what we're about to enter. You know? Where this is a papers, please, you better not be a fucking woman, you know, kind of state. Even the far right in Europe doesn't have this kind of sauce. Jesus Christ, dude. You know, like, it's funny. A lot of the far right in Europe have genuinely adopted talking points that are very reminiscent of liberal feminism, talking about how backwards and conservative a lot of, like, I don't know, Muslim immigrants are or whatever, to say, like, yeah, we need to not integrate these people into society because they would threaten the voting rights of women if they take power or some shit, right? Like, there's some lines that the European far right has thus far been unwilling to cross that the Republicans are like, yeah, fuck that. Joke-ass country, dude. And we're all the punchline for living in it, except Real Cryoraptor. He doesn't live here. That's good for him. Yeah, Steven Universe could not redeem these people. And I know that fucking kid loves redeeming the bad guys. We just have to wait till the average voter gets mad, starts punching things, does all the work for us. Kind of, yeah. There's a meme about like, all right, wait faster. You can't really do that, but there is a way in which you can, right? There's nothing we can do at this point to prevent the fascists from taking the power that they want to have, right? They're going to have, this kind of power to disenfranchise people. Free and fair elections are done where the midterms aren't going to matter. Even if a Democrat wins, if the Democrats retake the House and Senate, it's still Jover. Even if a Democrat wins the presidency in 28, it's still Jover. But that doesn't mean there's nothing that we can do. That means that we've lost the electoral game for now, right? What we can still do is we can hasten the defeat of the fascists by fomenting public discontent. Just being vocally left-leaning with your friends. You obviously, in some circumstances, you gotta tread carefully so the fucking cops don't come and be like, all right, fucking Che Guevara, you're going to Gulag, But if you can, participate in it just even in a little way and being like, man, this whole thing is fucked up, it's shit ain't right that oligarchs can just literally buy a whole ass country and ruin all of our lives, and they can be like, yeah, we don't care that the far right just literally took away the rights of women to vote and shit like that. Maybe we should do something about that. If you can convince somebody of that point, great. That's all the more quickly that this regime comes to its eventual downfall, right? Because fascists are incompetent. In order to be this evil, you have to be like going about things irrationally. Any rational authoritarian, because such a thing does exist, would not cross some of the lines that fascists are crossing. Ruining our relationships with other countries, being so blatant about targeting minorities that there's barely a veneer of hiding it anymore. Being so openly hostile and disdainful of the American public that, they're just saying now, I think Speaker Johnson said, yeah, our goal is to eliminate people on Medicare. And then he added, who shouldn't be there. I assure you, it is not hard to convince people that, these government stooges and, rich people stooges are our enemies here, And that matters in the long term. The unfortunate news is that, we might not live to see it, but this regime, by definition, cannot last forever. They are too incompetent to act rationally. When they're so transparently evil, that is eventually going to lead to them, angering the public enough cumulatively over time that the public backlash starts mounting, and eventually the government's going to collapse, along with the entire economy. Now, one obviously happens before the other. The economy is going to collapse long before this regime collapses, right? But what I'm trying to say here is that this is just a component part of society collapsing at the behest of fascists. Fascists cannot run a government for shit, right? The problem is, if they have enough power, and it looks like the fascists in America do, our rights are going to burn to the ground along with society. We just have to be there ready to build it up once they've burned it all down. Does that make sense? I know I'm kind of doing the meme that, I can't wait for society to burn to the ground so that my ideology can rise from the ashes. But at this point, the society burning down bit is inevitable because the fascists have already taken power. We're just hoping for them to burn it down completely enough that everybody will remember that it's their fault. And Gotron, you're right. If evil were competent, you know what it would be? Liberal. The sort of lawful evil, the intelligent evil that would be needed to maintain a stable authoritarian government in this country probably exists for the most part in the Democratic Party rather than in the Republican Party. And that's part of why I think the Democratic Party needs to die. There are some genuinely good people and with good political aspirations in the Democratic Party. People like AOC, like Rashida Tlaib, like Bernie Sanders, like Ilhan Omar, and so on, right? But the vast majority of them are these bloviating Don Beyer, Tim Kaine type of fucks, and Mark Warner too, name dropping my 3 representatives, whose only issue with the Republicans is that they're not doing the authoritarianism competently enough. And if given power right now, the Democrats would simply try to stabilize the mess that Republicans created. They are the competent authoritarians to the Republicans' incompetent authoritarian. Yeah, literally, people didn't get the message after World War II. It goes all the way back to that. Nazi Germany was actually, truthfully, on the verge of collapse, were it not for the Second World War, and even at the end of the Second World War. Academics at the time wrote about how Germany was kind of like on the eve of a revolution, low-key. Like, the Nazis were so evil and bad at running a government that the socialists were... Like, there was a growing socialist movement that was ready to overthrow them. It was not, like, maybe not ready at the time the Allies rolled in, but it was clear that even, like, if the Allies didn't occupy Germany, that they, like, the Nazi government was not long for this world, in, like, 1944. They were managing the economy that badly. The difference is, right, at the end of World War II, we actually never got to see a genuine and full collapse of fascism during peacetime. Because right after World War II, the Allies replaced the governments of Italy and Germany from the outside. They propped up a more liberal system of government, which effectively just rewound the clock to before the crisis happened and they capitulated to fascism, right? And then in Spain and other fascist countries that organically sort of dissipated, they had connections and allies in Europe. They had been stabilized. The fascist government had been stabilized, and gradually, in its own self-interest of like self-preservation, the government stopped being fascist basically because of internal public pressure and them becoming more rational over time. They basically acknowledged being Nazis is a bad look, so let's not do that. And the more they started acting rationally, the more they just gradually defaulted back to liberalism. We are now seeing a fascism that is completely immune from being rescued by liberals. That is the face of the end of fascism in the 20th century, is that those governments were rescued by liberals. Those fascists that, many of whom faced the music for war crimes, many of them were rehabilitated by the liberals. Operation Paperclip. Many of the German politicians who were part of the Nazi party were politicians in the West German government after the war. They never had a real revolution where fascists were thrown in chimney closures. Yeah, they've had peaceful revolutions. Portugal had the Flower Revolution, which is great and all. I love them for that. I support them. But we have never seen a fascism that has collapsed so completely with so little help from outside that something genuinely different had to come up in its place. And I know this is still technically part of the segment about the SAVE Act that's about disenfranchising women and stuff. But the stripping away of people's rights is so blatant, coupled with the economic mismanagement, the graft, the corruption. It is so blatant and so literally unsustainable. Eventually something is going to give, and unlike after World War II, no external liberal regime is going to come and save the fascists from the collapse of their own country. Unfortunately, that could mean that a lot more people are going to die, and I don't think anybody really fancies the prospect of that. Nor should we. But better things are possible, is what I'm saying. Every successful move the fascists make is just one step they take closer to their eventual decline, right? It's like the dialectic advancing or some shit like that. Imagine China does a Germany to America. That would have to be it. if there is any way out of this that doesn't involve such a total collapse of fascism that it takes capital with it, and, you know, if there's any route through this where the government collapses but a socialist revolution doesn't happen, again, we're talking in terms that might exceed the span of my lifetime. Things are going to get pretty bad for pretty long. It would have to be that either Europe or China, in their new ascendant sort of position, rewinds the clock of liberalism in the United States and sort of puts us back in a social democratic sort of Keynesian style government, which wouldn't be terrible, but it would ultimately just be resetting the clock to an earlier point that would start ticking down, and eventually we would repeat this crisis all over again. People's rights would be stripped all over again. It would just take a few extra generations, you know? Imagine China does Germany to America. Like, you mean with, like, war reparations? If anything, that would hasten an even worse crisis. Hi, Yoshi. Imagine if this rewinding the clock scenario happens forever, just different countries do it to different people. It's possible that something like that happens, but eventually there is going to come a point where there are no more countries to rewind that clock, you know? Picture, like, with the end of feudalism. The end of feudalism didn't happen all at once. There was a point that you could characterize as sort of like the beginning of the end, but feudalism continued to be like the order of the day in a lot of countries, even after that, you know? And it was a very gradual sort of change, you know? And then, like, over the course of a few decades, or even like a century, it eventually came to the point that the world order was no longer feudal and colonial, but it was more liberal and capitalist. Still colonial in you know, in that sense, but, like, you know what I mean? Revolutions can be gradual like that. And in the least optimistic scenario that I can construct, that is what happens, and it probably takes several generations after us to realize a full transition to a post-capitalist world, you know, like a socialist, market socialist kind of setting, right? But it is also possible that you know, China or Europe doesn't get involved to the degree that the rest of the world got involved after World War II. Because after World War II, it was a direct harkening back to World War One. A war had just been fought, and Germany had just lost. Of course, there was going to be some pressure on countries to rebuild after a massive war occurred. But war doesn't really occur in the same way anymore. Conventional ground war is very rare. You know, Ukraine and Russia is very much the exception rather than the rule. That's the only war I can really remember in recent times that even kind of resembles World Wars I and II, where you have fronts on a battlefield and two countries are directly fighting each other with their own militaries, you know, in what we would recognize as more the developed world, for land, and pushing back and forth like that. Most wars that I've seen in my lifetime have been sort of like the Syrian civil war, where it's one country or maybe two descending into absolute madness because of instability wrought by, like, you know, that country being hollowed out. There's a million different rebel groups and stuff like that, you know, to such an extent that sometimes sides aren't even really distinct. Seems like every person is their own faction. Need to go back to trench warfare. Legitimate. Well, what I'm saying here is that I think that it's probably more likely that the United States collapses without any sort of rescuing intervention from Europe or China to prop up a sort of more Keynesian liberal government after the fact, right? Because there's not the sort of reason for them to do that. We've already severed all the relationships. We've already cut the umbilical that would be the reason they'd have to prop up the United States, right? We're still economically relevant, but we're not interconnected enough anymore. Like, or at least we won't be, for them to be like, we desperately need to repair America. You know? We won't be relevant for long. I disagree. America is a big country, and it has a lot of resources. I think we will still be relevant, just not to the extent that we are right now, right? Or that we were. Up until Trump took office, America was so embedded into the global economy. We were so relevant that we could be a global debtor. Think about that. We owed a shit ton of countries a lot of money, you know? But it was in their interest to just let us keep borrowing money. Because if we defaulted on any one of our debts, they'd be screwed. The whole world would be screwed, you know? Because it would undermine the confidence in the fidelity of America as a trading partner. And nobody wanted that, you know? But bringing it all back, again, this is still technically part of the segment where I'm talking about the SAVE Act. This is blatantly, you know, a law meant to disenfranchise women from being able to vote. Stuff like this genuinely heralds the decline of fascism, or the decline of liberalism, or whatever. Like, the lines between the two are becoming a lot more blurred as of late. Like I said, liberalism literally becomes fascism eventually. We're pushing up against and through the boundaries of what you could even consider rational acting on the part of a government or any political entity, right? You know, the rampant graft and corruption with regards to the tariffs and the stock market, like fucking such burning hatred and disdain of political minorities like women and like migrants and brown people and trans people, that they will pass laws that literally nobody wanted, cared about, or asked for, just to like make their lives worse, you know? All of this stuff is not good for the longevity of a political regime, you know? It doesn't necessarily violate the sort of assent or consent of the governed right away. You know, there are plenty of really authoritarian dictatorships around the world that are relatively stable and have similar laws on the books, but that's because they understand the boundaries that they're pushing up against, and they're sort of, I guess, to a greater degree than this administration, at least. Yeah, I don't know. I guess, you know, I'm turning into a broken record of sorts. I can only say the same thing so many times, right? I'm not going to mince words about it. The SAVE Act is fucking horrible. It is Nazi shit. Literally, like, women should be in the house or whatever the fuck. Women shouldn't have rights. Pretty straightforwardly, that's the objective of this law. And it's going to be like that for a long time. But as long as, like, the society, like, burns to the ground pretty completely, then there's not really a chance that it gets remade in the image of fascism. I'm just worried another country will show up and be like, you need liberalism. Well, I explained why. I don't think that's terribly likely. But either way, you and me we're probably going to be retirement age by the time that happens. If that happens. That time I actually did go out of my way to hit that guy because he went out of his way to hit me a couple times. So now we're even. Did I bomb? Oh my god, I didn't mean to do that. Yoshi, I am so sorry. You didn't deserve that, Fate. Yeah. Thing to remember is in Star Wars, the Republic lasted 1,000 years. Star City's empire barely lasted 30 years. Yes, the Nazi government in Germany, even with war plunder to fuel them, only lasted 12 years. You know? And the Republican days of the United States, small R Republican, Irish Republican, the classic, lasted about 200 something years, right? The empire in America, if we're drawing like 1-to-1, right? 250 years, empire is probably going to last 10 or 20 years. Like it ain't that deep. The empire in America is not going to last very long precisely because of the irrationality that it brings, Like, if it's constantly doing shit like this, if it's just making everybody's life miserable, you can only do that so much, right? Like, even dictatorships, in fact, especially dictatorships, depend on the thumbs up from the public in order to thrive. And you know who knows this better than anybody? China. President Xi, the Communist Party over there. They know this. That's why they've been doing so many infrastructure projects. That's why they've been doing the Belt and Road Initiative, trying, like, fervently and feverishly to establish all these trade relationships and like build up railroads and make urban connectivity a lot better and stuff like that. Genuinely, they have an interest in nation building because they want the country to be stable. Otherwise, they risk revolution from below. You have to keep the masses happy. And that doesn't just mean provide them bread and circuses. That means, like, legitimately, you have to make their lives livable. You have to make their lives good enough that they're willing to overlook abuses of power and human rights, like violations, from the government. And if you're also hollowing out life from an economic perspective, if you're just making everybody's life absolutely shit, they have no reason to overlook anything that you do. People are willing to put up with the government in China because they could probably list a lot of things that the government has done for them. Think about what China was like 40 years ago versus what it's like now. There were people in China who were alive in the 70s when it was one of the poorest countries in the world. And look what's happened in the past 50 years. Now they're an economic power to rival the United States, And they've done this, granted, through neoliberal development policies, but there are a lot of things that they've done to reduce the price of housing, to reduce the price of of commodities and healthcare, despite the fact that they still have a private healthcare system, to improve the working conditions, despite the fact the working conditions over there still aren't very good, to basically develop the country industrially and technologically to bring it up to par, so that people can look at the past 50 years and be like, you know what? Maybe this government's all right because it's done some pretty good shit for me and my kids and my family. Even though, I don't know, maybe you hear about the kind of abuses that are taking place in what is it, East Turkestan or whatever with the Uyghurs, even though they've since kind of eased up a little bit on that. Maybe you hear about the kind of shit that's happening in Tibet, the suppression that's going on there. Maybe you know about the brutal treatment that Hong Kong protesters are subject to, right? But the government has done enough material good for a lot of people that people are willing to overlook that. That's not me saying that China is good or the government is good. That's me materially describing how China has managed to remain stable. And America is unwilling to engage it. Under fascist governance, America seems blatantly unwilling to engage in the nation building that China has done for decades. In fact, the fascists in America are, with bills like the SAVE Act, with the tariffs, with incorporating oligarchs into the government, but with Doge cutting everything, they're doing the exact opposite of nation building. They are speed running their own decline and destruction by destroying all of the pillars of civil society and social society that would be able to theoretically hold them up if they were smarter. Leftist meme. Yes, this is why tankies exists, kind of, because at the core of it, people look at these countries. A lot of people talk up China and to a lesser extent Russia, I think, as well. At the core of it, although I disagree with tankies on plenty of shit, the reason people do that is because everybody wants to believe that better things are possible. Chinese history is very complicated. Yeah, that's true. Look, there's been a lot of different like Chinese empires and states and whatever in that region, but like China as a concept is a very, very long enduring thing. Basically, from the first time that all of like China was united in one state, the concept of China has been like a fixture in people's minds politically. Like when people say China, they understand the region that you're referring to, even if there are warring states there. You know, it's like for most of like fucking written history and whatever that we can remember societies existing in, China has been like a concept that exists. You know? But at the end of the day, leftist me, right? I've fucking fluent in Japanese over here, right? You know, me, clearly I've got the gas in me right now because I've got my new haircut and shit like that. I don't know. And, you know, I know there's also a lot of people that are like, that's great and all, but, like, what about us? What, you know, what the fuck do we do? You know, we're having trouble affording rent over here and shit like that. You know, I sympathize. You know, form a tenants union. Form a union at work, even if it potentially could get you fired. Like, you know, you got to do what you can. And most importantly, above all else, talk to your friends. You know, talk to people about politics. Get comfortable talking about politics more. Because this is one of my favorite sayings. Even if you don't do politics, politics is going to do you regardless. So you better start paying attention. Start talking about it. Start talking about how, like, oligarchs being in the government is all some bullshit. The fact that they're just taking away everybody's rights and taking a sledgehammer to everything that ever did anything good in this country is some bullshit. And, you know, somebody should really do something about it. You know, even if there's not that much that can directly be done by any of us right now, talking about it is important because that creates the awareness that this has to go from a prescriptive point of view. Right? Have you seen how funny it is when fascists try to solve the freight problem? You mean like the trolley problem? They fucking slam the stick down the middle, multi-track drifting, kill all of them instead of choosing between one or the other? Because that's what I imagine would happen. Didn't Revenge of the Sith have a dig? Yeah, you know what? Funnily enough, Revenge of the Sith has a funny dig to that effect where Obi-Wan says, I'm not brave enough for politics. You know, who among us, you know, couldn't relate to something like that, right? You know, politics, fucking minefield of its own. But in the end, he ends up absolutely going through it precisely because of political events and changes that occurred, you know? He said, I don't do politics, and then politics did him regardless. You know? Anyways, future me, this segment went all over the place. Cut it there. Thanks for watching, and support the channel if you would be so kind.